The United States is the largest debtor in the world, with around $39 trillion in total debt. That is equal to roughly 120% of the country's entire GDP, and it is increasing by nearly $7 billion every single day. This number is so large that it is hard to imagine. It is bigger than the entire economies of many countries combined. Every second, interest costs keep rising, and every year Washington adds more borrowing to fill its budget deficit. But here is the question. Who actually owns U.S. debt? Is it China? Is it Japan? Is it Wall Street? Or does America mostly owe money to itself? In this video, we break down who owns America's $39 trillion debt, why it matters, and whether this growing debt is becoming a real economic crisis. First, let's understand U.S. debt. The U.S. national debt is the total amount of money the U.S. government has borrowed over time to cover its budget deficit. In April 2026, it had reached roughly $39 trillion. That's about $114,000 for every American. Compared with 1 year ago, total debt has increased by about $2.77 trillion, and over the past 5 years, it has risen by roughly $10.9 trillion. At this pace, another $1 trillion could be added in just a few months. So how does debt rise this fast? The answer is budget deficits. A budget deficit simply means the government spends more money in 1 year than it collects through taxes and other income sources. For example, if the U.S. collects $4 trillion in taxes but spends $5 trillion, there is a $1 trillion gap. That gap is called the deficit. And to cover this gap, the government borrows money by issuing treasury bonds, treasury notes, and treasury bills. When deficits happen year after year, they build up over time. That is how the national debt keeps growing. Now, let's discuss who owns America's debt. America's total debt is divided into two major parts such as public debt and intergovernmental debt. Out of the $39 trillion total, around $31.5 trillion is public debt and the remaining around $7.5 trillion is intergovernmental debt. Out of the total public debt, about $17.7 trillion is held by domestic investors. This includes mutual funds, pension funds, individual investors, banks, insurance companies, and other institutions. This shows that a large share of America's debt is actually owned within the United States itself. The next large share of public debt is held by foreign investors. They own around $9 trillion, which is roughly 24% of America's total debt. So foreign countries do hold a lot of U.S. debt, but they do not own the majority of it. Among them, Japan is the largest holder, with around $1.2 trillion. Next is the United Kingdom, holding approximately $0.9 trillion. China follows behind with roughly $0.7 trillion. For many years, China was one of the largest buyers of U.S. Treasury bonds in the world. However, it has gradually reduced its holdings over the past few years. Instead of relying on U.S. debt, China has now been diversifying its foreign reserves into other assets. This is due to the rising political and economic tensions between Washington and Beijing, which has encouraged China to reduce its dependence on U.S. financial assets where possible. This is also linked to de-dollarization, where countries try to reduce their reliance on the U.S. dollar in global trade, reserves, and finance. China is still a major holder of U.S. debt, but it is no longer increasing its holdings the way it once did. Meanwhile, Japan has remained a steady and important buyer of U.S. treasuries. Additionally, the U.S. Federal Reserve itself holds a large portion of the debt, about $4.4 trillion. This is mainly to support its monetary policy operations and manage interest rates to stabilize the economy. The next major part of America's debt is called intergovernmental debt, worth more than $7.5 trillion. This is money that one part of the government owes to another part of the government. For example, programs like Social Security and Medicare sometimes collect more money than they need. That extra money is invested in U.S. Treasury securities to earn interest. In simple words, in intergovernmental debt, the government borrows from its own trust funds and promises to pay them back later with interest. Now, let's discuss whether America's debt is becoming dangerous. Debt becomes dangerous when several problems happen at the same time. Interest costs rise too fast, Investors lose confidence, economic growth slows, and budget deficits stay high year after year. And right now, America faces several of these problems. Over the past years, interest rates have risen much faster. That means the government must pay more when it borrows new money or refinances old debt. As a result, annual interest payments on America's public debt have climbed above $1 trillion. That is a huge amount of money spent simply to service past borrowing. The more tax money that goes toward interest, the less money is available for roads, defense, and education. It can also force the government to borrow even more, creating a cycle where debt leads to more debt. This is when a large debt load can become a real burden. Despite the risks, the United States still has major advantages that many other countries do not. First, the US dollar remains the world's primary reserve currency. Many countries, central banks, and companies use dollars for trade and international payments. Because of this, global demand for US Treasury assets remains high. Second, the US Treasury market is considered one of the safest and most liquid markets in the world. It means investors can buy and sell US Treasury securities easily in very large amounts. During crises, money often flows into treasuries because they are seen as a safe place to park money. These benefits give the US greater flexibility to borrow money and help reduce the risk of default. So, America's $39 trillion debt is huge. A large portion of this debt is owned by Americans themselves, including pension funds, banks, insurance companies, and individual investors. Another large portion is held by the Federal Reserve. Only a smaller share is held by foreign governments and international investors. In the end, the real concern is not just the size of the debt. It is how fast it keeps growing compared to the economy. If debt grows faster than the economy for a long time, then it can start creating real pressure on the country's finances.